Hello, my friends. This is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie, and today I am sending another message to you, giving you a call, tapping in, saying hi, and wondering aloud. And today I'm thinking about the nature of wondering aloud, all the while wondering at the fact that we say anything aloud, you know? It's interesting to conceive what we call the public space, what we think of as being the public world, what we call the public as opposed to the private, is made up of that which we say. It's made up of that which we speak, we create. And so it's interesting because we sort of take for granted this sort of fact that there are so many people out there who speak their minds. There are so many people who are, as they say, extroverted. And in that extroversion, they chatter. Some become artists, some become musicians, some become creators, some channel that communication into chiseled forms. And what are the effects of this? You know, this so-called public space that is made up of this cacophony of different people all speaking at once, you know? It's not as if it were a rambling mess, because when you zone in on any specific person or any specific set of things being said, there's always clarity and there's always a sense of concision in it. And so the question is, what motivates people, though, to speak at all, you know? What does it take to speak, to have a voice, to not merely speak, but to speak in such a way that you're carrying something more than the weak imitation of thought? You know, that in itself raises the question, what is real thought? You know? And what is astonishment? And are the two connected? These are the kind of thoughts that a philosophical person runs with. And these are the kind of thoughts that I sort of try and build with, and I try to speak in tribute to that process by speaking as the process itself, given that I am it. And so you'll hear in this meditative sequence a diffusion of ideas and incremental tendencies of which I'm inclined towards. You'll also hear me stumbling over my own speech as I try to say more than I could possibly say. But that's so much of what speech is, you know? And so I suppose a part of the difficulty is that it's a monologue as opposed to a dialogue. And so I suppose it's because I'm having to build upon my own voice that there is some difficulty in this. And it's for that reason that there's a kind of lull in my voice. And it's amazing that I am so arrogant as to post this online, to post myself speaking in such a rambling, incoherent way. But to be honest, I'm not even trying to say anything. I am speaking just to speak because I'm attempting to create something. And so much of this is sort of mass material, sort of material like fodder, material like chaos that I hope over time to work into and discipline into something like an order, something like coherency. And so I find coherency in asking that question. What is it that motivates a person to speak aloud at all? And I think it has something to do with the fact that in speaking aloud, others sort of hear themselves in you. That whenever you are participating in that process, there's something that is happening beneath it all that isn't necessarily explicit. And that thing that is happening is that there's a recognition that others make in hearing what it is that you have to say. And so there's a sense in which we discover ourselves when other people say things that we had never thought. I mean, surely you, dear listener, have had that experience in a song, in a movie, or in a book, where you suddenly recognize yourself, you suddenly see yourself, you suddenly hear yourself. It's very strange, and it's so strange that it's difficult to speak about. And I think there's so many things that I say that sound difficult because it's difficult to say. And you could always say that I'm missing what is obvious or that I am thinking too much. But I don't have that problem, you know. I'm performative in the sense that I participate in that process by thinking experimentally and sort of thinking on the go. And I suppose that's the impetus within this, is to develop and cultivate that capacity to speak that is so musical in us. And I suspect that philosophy, if it is to be human, if philosophy is to be grounded in its own discovered precepts, one of those being the existential incarnation of all thought, then why wouldn't I speak in terms of rhythms? Because doesn't the body itself entail a rhythm? You know, when we listen to ourselves, we also listen to a kind of pattern, a kind of shape shifting that isn't shape shifting alone, but is shifting into something that perhaps is appeasing to our ear and our eye. And it's for that reason that I add my own little conjecture, which is that there is something to be said about philosophy not being science. We know it's not. I mean, clearly, very few people would argue with that, except for those that would say that science is the only thing that matters and philosophy doesn't matter. But most people see these things as separate. However, my conjecture is that there's a musical element to philosophy. Now, it doesn't mean that philosophical arguments are meaningless, or that the back and forth isn't about ideas or about technical things, or that we're not participating in that long tradition that has to do with pursuing those existential questions as well as those ontological questions about the world. It doesn't mean that we lose anything. It means that what has to be included is the sense in which we are a species that largely speaks just to speak. We enjoy making sounds. And to tie it back into what I was saying earlier, and a part of the message is to learn to develop notions and tie them back into other notions within that pattern speech, so that something like a formal thing arises. That's my urge within these creations, and it's also why I speak so freely, even though I'm walking into a big old spider web. Ugh, nothing stickier than that. But to tie it back into what I was saying, there is a sense in which the music and what we say is a form within which we can create that spontaneous content. And by spontaneous content, I mean the whole world of people that on Google, on the internet, on the World Wide Web are constantly putting out videos talking about themselves. There are people who are constantly making content that has to do with developing their own little view of the world. And contrary to what a lot of people think, which is that this is superficial or that it's all a waste of time, I think it has a very important place in our world. I think that what we think of as narcissistic, self-centered people, we think of it as a bad thing, but I think of it as a natural part of being human, because in doing so, they illuminate all the different myriad, or all the different ways in which a person can be human. And there's a sense in which that festival of selfhood, that big old carnival that we call the internet, is a space within which we can put ourselves together, in the sense that a book is another space within which we put ourselves together. And of course, all of this is simply an experimental thought. But I do think that, as well as being an experimental thought, it helps me to work through and illuminate my own positions philosophically, which I don't think you develop logically. I think on a certain level you wake up one fine day to discover that something is apparent to you, or that you have what could be called a conviction or a belief. However, it doesn't mean that you have certainty or that you're guaranteed. It just means that there are thoughts within you that you, over time, more or less take for granted as being true. And to me, the aesthetic or aesthesis, which I've mentioned in many recordings before, not because it's an obsession of mine, but because it's an element in my own thinking that I'm working through. One feature of that is the aesthetic, because what I mean by that is that a part of my own thinking is that we are animals, and many people forget this, or they think that we have some kind of access to a reality outside of this, or that they will say things like, we are not a superior species, so don't be a speciesist. Don't say things like the human species is superior. But then they'll go about saying things like talking about astrology as if that in itself weren't an expression of speciesism. I mean, astrology in itself is the belief that the world is organized around our desires and our needs. And so what I mean to say is that that once you see the body for what it is, once you see that we are bodies, you begin realizing that if a thought is expressed that pretends to go beyond that, it is to be automatically questioned. And so any claim to transcendence, any claims to like identity that supersedes the body, all of that can be held as being sus. And by sus, I mean that we ought to be, or at least I am, sort of just sort of turned off by the reified language, by abstract language, by the language that even if it's critiquing a certain tradition, it itself doesn't live up to that critique, because it doesn't really live up to its own claims, because you can see the degree to which certain like ideas are built into our language and logic, and those are ideas that for all intents and purposes are Cartesian. And you can be, as it said, Heideggerian, and you can go about questioning this split. But I think what you discover is that even then you still fail to live up to it, because to really see that that thought is inherently embodied, that we are embodied beings, also means that you, on a certain level, accept your own body, your own personality. And I'm not at all talking about like body acceptance or anything like that. What I mean is that you don't attempt to create this like neat little separation between what is to be focused on and what is to be not, insofar as one is not afraid to include the body's own intrusions into thought. And of course, I'm still speaking in an abstract language. And so you could say that a part of the process is not to simply argue better, but to speak differently. And that's a refrain that I repeat to myself that I inherited from Richard Rorty. And what Richard Rorty had said was that it's not new arguments that change the world, it's different ways of speaking. And so I think that is related to the aesthetic, and that is related to the body, and that is related to the inclusion of the other within the self. And by the inclusion of the other within the self, I mean that we are able to live through our own idiosyncratic strangeness. And I think that a part of what I'm doing in this is including that enigmatic otherness, that is the strangeness of the self, that is always already in front of us. And we are always already stranger than we can suppose. And so it's not that there's some kind of incredible transcendental romantic mystery, but that we ought to see philosophical thinking as being at least partially a kind of process of slicing that superstitious fat from our souls. And I think that is a very beneficial thing, insofar as it helps one to shed some of that metaphysical weight that accrues through sort of 2,000 years of philosophical language. And what it brings with it is a tendency to miss what is fresh, what is obvious. Not that it can't comprehend it or work with it, but we have a perpetual propensity to bamboozle ourselves. And again, that's not to say that philosophy isn't needed, but that the philosopher must be attentive to the limits of philosophy, and that over time will come to mean many things, and it can mean many things. But the point that is being worked out here has to do with the fact that there's a certain level at which the reason why they create the public space, or the reason why there's a question of what the public space is, and it has to do with the generation of this self that is only grasped once somebody says it. So, for instance, somebody will tell a story, and it's a story you've never heard before, but in that story, you might just start hearing something that helps you make sense of your own life. And that's a strange kind of phenomenon that must be a part of the interplay in humans. It must be a part of our fundamental orientation, because I think that we still don't really fully grasp what it means to be a linguistic creature, to have cognition, to have culture. Those are two features of the human that are tricky to even see for what they are. And I think that they have strengths and they have weaknesses. And that in itself is something that could be examined over time. And the question then is, how many of these themes can a person possibly work out at once, you know? I always step back and think how strange it would be for anyone to hear me thinking, given how elliptical, and speaking of idiosyncratic and strange, my own thinking is, because I've been doing it on my own for so long now. And now I'm putting out recordings that are super low quality so that I don't have any sense of like perfectionism in me, and I'm now writing in such a way where I can see, at least tentatively, what it is that I'm doing. And I can see that between the reading that I do and the writing and these recordings and then the listening, that there is something occurring. However, you have to have a kind of a back and forth relationship with it so that it can grow. And I suppose what that is the development of the voice. And the voice is something that must grow as a way of organizing these features within and these features without. And yet, this is certainly one of the more opaque of my messages. And I think that opacity is a feature of my own thought that I didn't really recognize until I began speaking. And so I suppose that it's not merely joy, but also a great difficulty that creates joy. And that difficulty is in the friction and confusion of trying to figure out what you think and separating it from what it is that you think you want to think, so that for once you can think clearly. If that makes sense. Perhaps when I go back and listen to this, it'll make sense to me. And perhaps I won't need to, because we still don't know what happens when we say anything out loud. We don't know enough about what we are. We do know that we constantly assume that we know what we are. And we don't tend to realize how little we know until it's too late.